So hello everybody. Thank you for joining today for what is a special early preview of the Opinion Mental Health in PR survey for 2022. I'm Gavin. I'm the MD of Assembly at Edelman. Also joining as one of the first cohort of mental health first aiders here at Edelman. Mental health is a subject I am passionate about. It's something I've suffered with in my life, both depression, also anxiety and stress in the workplace. I've also spent 25 years, or probably more than 25 now, working in an industry where mental health issues are prevalent and continue to be so. Spoiler alert, and Isabel, I hope I'm not stealing your thunder too much here, but this year's survey has revealed that 91% of those in PR have experienced mental health issues to some extent in the past year, which is up from 2021. Also, 30% have found their job stressful, again, up slightly from 2021. Look, the good news is the pandemic has meant that our understanding of mental health and well-being, us talking about it proactively, has improved. And Edelman, for one, has also made great strides in recent years. But it's very clear there's still a lot more to do. Mental health challenges in the workplace are still prevalent. There's also still a stigma attached to mental health, and many still don't feel empowered to speak up when there are challenges. It's also clear workload and burnout in PR remain key issues, impacting the sector at large, but also the professionals within it. And there's an old saying that's kind of often rolled out in PR when it is busy and stressful, that it's PR, not ER. That's still being said today as it was when I first heard it in the 90s. And it does sometimes feel like we're doing ER in this industry. Mental health's been a key focus for us at Edelman for many years now, both locally and globally. And this year, to mark World Mental Health Day, we closed our offices across the world for the second year running. But our commitment to promoting mental health and positive mental health goes beyond one day a year. It's one step in our ongoing efforts to build a culture where the well-being of our teams is at front and center, and where we're respecting boundaries between work and life. This year, the theme for World Mental Health Day was making mental health and well-being for all a global priority. And I think today, especially in the face of increasing economic, societal challenges, the aftershocks of COVID, a war in Ukraine, a climate emergency, and a cost of living crisis, which is only kind of getting worse, it's really vital we ensure that we continue to protect mental health in the workplace and beyond, and that we keep talking about it. Fostering an environment where people do feel comfortable to speak up when they're experiencing mental health issues, or any barrier that is stopping our people doing their best work, is critical to our success as an industry. It's why both empathy and empowerment are two of the 7 pillars of our EMEA social contract here at Edelman. We've also trained mental health first aiders across the UK business at all levels, myself included. We're also rolling out that across other offices in the Edelman business. These people are involved in mental health initiatives that have been rolled out at Edelman, and some that will be rolled out as we move into our new UK office. This year, we were proud to be awarded a silver award by Mind in its annual mental health audit. Last year was the first year we took part, and we got bronze. So it's really encouraging to see that some of the initiatives that we put in place are starting to make an impact, but it's still silver, and it's still clear that there's more work to be done, not just for us, but for the wider industry. Which does bring us today. So this is part of our ongoing commitment. It's the 4th year running that we've hosted this event in partnership with the CIPR, PRCA and Opinium. We've got a fantastic panel here today for hopefully a great discussion once we've been through the survey for this year. Also, this is meant to be a safe and supportive environment for the attendees here today. I know that speaking about mental health can sometimes be challenging, but we're hoping we not only give you insight here today, but also give you some helpful tips that you can then take on to help better support yourself and your teams. And if you do need support following the event, we will be posting some really helpful resources from Mind and the MHFA. And we also urge you to connect with MFHAs, if you have access to them, colleagues, friends or relatives, if you are having challenges. Often speaking about it is the first step to overcoming them. Bit of housekeeping. We'd love you to join the conversation on Twitter. We're going to be using the hashtags Edelman Health and Mental Health Matters today, and we'll be posting from the @Edelman UK channel. And with that, I'm delighted to hand over to Isabel Hunt from Opinion to share the results. Over to you, Isabel.
Amazing, thank you, Gavin. Hi everyone, I'm Isabel. I'm a research manager at Opinion. I've been lucky enough to be involved in this audit ever since it started for the last 4 years, and very excited to start the conversation by kind of sharing our audit results this year before we open up to the panel. So give me 2 minutes whilst I just quickly click all the buttons to share the PowerPoint. Get the thumbs up from Gavin that it's all okay, and perfect, before I've even clicked the next button. Cool, well, I shall begin. We'll dive straight in. As we've mentioned, this is our kind of 4th audit. There's a lot that we have kind of tracked from previous years, and this year we switched up a section of the report. So there are some sections which are new, which is really exciting to be able to kind of start developing the conversation as we look to continue our relationship and the conversation in general about mental well-being. So just to set the scene, obviously we're talking here about mental well-being, which everyone has to some level, whether that's higher one day, lower another day. Everyone experiences mental well-being, and you know, a big part of having kind of good mental well-being is its impact on productivity, which is where, you know, it has a real relevance to businesses. Who we spoke to, so this year we had a sample size of 175, which, just to flag once, I won't keep talking about it, but is slightly smaller than we have seen in previous years. So there's just one section that we won't be covering today, which is on reasons for taking time off. But other than that, just kind of a huge thank you to everyone who did take part in the survey. Obviously, your results kind of help us to start this conversation and to see where things are sitting. So a big thank you. And in general, the kind of topic areas. So we've always included our Warwick Edinburgh mental wellbeing scale, which is essentially 14 statements, all positively phrased, about mental well-being, asking things like if you felt valued in the last 2 weeks, how you're feeling. And we use that to develop a mental well-being score and an average score, which we'll talk about in just a second. But essentially, a higher score means higher mental well-being. And then we move on to talk about overall well-being, mental health, particularly at work, support that you get at work. And then we added a new section this year, which is all about your work environment versus your home environment, how people are responding to flexible working and things like that. So just to start off, looking at the mental well-being kind of landscape at first. So this year we've seen a slight positive increase in the mental well-being scores for the PR industry. So those numbers there are the score every year, and as I mentioned, a higher score equals higher mental well-being. What we've typically tended to see is the PR industry sits slightly behind the average UK worker. So the PR industry is the dark blue line, and the average UK worker is the grey line. And we saw a kind of more dramatic reaction to the pandemic back in 2020 for the PR industry. And what we've actually seen this year is that UK workers in general have gone down, whereas the PR has continued to make small progress, and it's now actually sitting above the average UK worker, which is great news. But then looking on the right-hand side, kind of, we do also see still high levels of people who have struggled with their mental health. So it's kind of consistently sat at this number ever since we started tracking. And just to kind of dive into that a little bit more, so again, that one is still higher even, than UK workers, which sits at 69%. So we do see more people in the PR industry tending to struggle with their mental health in some form. And typically this chart, we kind of look at a similar one kind of every year, where we see just higher levels of stress, of feeling low and down, of anxiety in the PR industry compared to UK workers. And as well as kind of that general well-being, so what have you experienced? We then also ask specifically, firstly, how stressful they find their job, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being much more stressful. And for PR, we see that sitting at just above 6 out of 10. The average UK worker just behind that at about 5. But this list on the right, and kind of diving into those reasons behind why PR industry workers are feeling kind of high levels of stress. Again, we typically see workload, having too much to do, and high levels of deadlines. This year we saw a slight increase in those who don't feel that they're good at their job. And then when we take that one step further and look at, okay, of those people who are experiencing kind of low mental health, who are feeling stressed at work, how many of those have taken time off work for their mental health? Again, we still see a lower proportion of PR professionals who then will take time off compared to the average UK worker. And when we again kind of dive into the reasons for why they're not taking time off, this is the first year that we've seen having too much to do at work not be the number one reason. So for the first time, it's still quite high, but it slipped to number 2. Which is a good sign that hopefully things are moving in this direction. But however, I wouldn't say that that doesn't mean that it's not still a big barrier. It's still kind of half of the people who have experienced poor mental health, but they're not taking time off for it. But just a good sort of start to nod in the right direction for this. And then the next section, we focus on those kind of drivers. So what is it that's driving poor mental well-being? And just to briefly kind of touch on this section, there's still a lot of work to do, and this is kind of an interesting area to chat about later. But just to focus on that top one, so the proportion of people who feel that their workplace really takes their mental health and the well-being of their employees seriously has dropped this year, down to 59%. And then also looking at a couple of the bottom ones, a higher proportion of people are feeling that their workplace isn't doing enough, and a higher proportion of people would feel embarrassed if their colleagues, kind of noticed that they were struggling with their mental health, which is obviously a few areas to look at. And then for the first time, we've switched up this section a little bit. So now we're looking at kind of hybrid working, obviously that being a kind of big impact on not just the PR industry, but everyone, as we're still kind of getting used to new ways of working post-COVID and all of that. We asked essentially people's preferences to their working circumstances, and we saw a huge majority that would prefer a hybrid mix. So 81%, so 4/5 would prefer a mixture of home and office working. But what we do see for the PR industry is a real kind of larger benefit than we see for the general UK worker in terms of working from home. So on the left, we see all of these benefits, kind of having a better work-life balance and not having to commute as much or drive to work, feeling more relaxed, as much higher. And then we see a lot less of the challenges, so finding it hard to draw boundaries and feeling isolated. We actually see a lot less of that for the industry. So it's really clear to see that it's had a really kind of positive impact on the changes. And then we ask people directly if the changes in their work pattern have impacted their mental well-being, and you can see just by the size of that bar chart that it's had an overwhelming kind of positive impact on increasing people's mental well-being. which is obviously lovely to report. And then finally, we focused on kind of the physical design of the working environment. So just asking people what they feel about their office versus their home environment. A few funky builds here. And what we found is that overall, people find that the office is much more lively than at home, which is very self-explanatory. People find that their home is a lot more appealing though, so 71% versus the office. People also still feel like their home is more inviting. My speaker is covering that whole side of the slide. And people feel that their home is more colourful, which obviously makes sense because they've designed their home, hopefully. And the whole idea about this section is to kind of, in the data, once we share the actual report, just kind of provide support for employers in terms of making sure that people can utilise their office for what it is and make sure that it's a space where people feel productive, as well as working from home, so that people can kind of experience the benefits of both. And just kind of touching on that idea that you can kind of utilize the environment and help promote kind of a place where people feel safe to do their work and feel encouraged. And then just to touch on the final thoughts. So this is kind of a summary of everything, which is obviously explained in a little bit more detail in the full report when that gets sent around. But what we see is that we continue to see small improvements in mental well-being, which are really continuing to show. And I think although these are really small steps, I think this is actually really a big kind of key part and really, really great to see, because especially when we do kind of tracking studies, we don't expect things to change dramatically unless we see a kind of big change in environment. So like with the pandemic, everyone saw a massive drop. And I think it can sometimes feel a little bit discouraging not to just see everything jumping back to normal. But I think it's really great that we have kind of seen this slow, steady increase, and that should be really encouraging for the industry. And we should continue to kind of look to do more and see where we can keep that movement and keep that progress. Obviously, however, we do see kind of still very high levels of poor mental health within the PR industry, and we really want to encourage kind of employers to continue to communicate the processes that are in place and have processes and procedures in place that really, you know, lighten that burden for people who do need to take time off and give them that real safe space to take the help that they need. Obviously, to address the biggest cause of stress and workloads, and kind of normalize a manageable workload, and then also to look at kind of hybrid working. And firstly, on one side, kind of how beneficial it's been, particularly to mental well-being, improving kind of work-life balance and things like that. But then also look at, you know, how we can ensure that both home and work are great environments that enhance like well-being and productivity together.
Great, thank you, Isabel. Lots to digest there. So I'm going to dive straight into our discussion and introduce our panel who are going to help us unpack some of that. So I'm pleased to be joined today by Isabel, who you've already heard from, Emily Wheeler, who's Head of Development at MQ Mental Health Research, Dr. Ashley Weinberg, Chartered Occupational Psychologist and Senior Lecturer in Psychology at the University of Salford. Hello, Dr. Amanda Potter, Chartered Occupational Psychologist, the CEO of Zircon and the host of the Chief Psychology Officer podcast. Hello, and Antonia Fabon, who's a consultant at Calder. So I'm going to open it with a question to everybody, and it'd be great if you could give a little intro as to who you are and then dive into the answer. What did you find most surprising, or was there anything that kind of really kind of stood out from the results this year? And I'll kick off with you, Emily.
Sure, thank you, Gavin, and thank you, Isabel, as well, for your presentation. It was really, really useful to go through that and see that kind of level of detail. So I head up our development team at MQ Mental Health. In terms of MQ, we're a mental health research charity. We fund on a global scale, and we are the UK's leading mental health research charity. So whilst there are many organisations out there doing the kind of stigma fighting and the kind of services provision, which are so needed, we are still really one of the only ones funding the research behind what it is that could prevent mental health from taking place in the first place, as well as all the way through the different treatments as well. So in terms of some of the things that I found really interesting from reading this, I think one of the things which is, I guess, surprising or good to see it kind of brought out in there was the fact that actually that 1 in 4 stats came out precisely in there, the fact that actually it was 25% of respondents said they had experienced some kind of mental illness over the last year. And that stands with the stats we see across the general population as well. So it was really interesting to kind of see that play out. So surprising in some senses to see it so clearly, but not, as it kind of reinforces some of the things we've seen. And then the other thing I think for me, again, in a similar vein, was seeing that particularly the proportion of people experiencing depression has increased the most in this kind of last year, up from, I think it was 35% from 26%. And again, it was interesting to see that start playing out, because sadly we know that by 2030, depression is set to be the leading cause of mortality and morbidity globally. So again, seeing that play out, I guess, in this kind of micro situation, but knowing that that's a much broader trend was really interesting to see. So yeah, really interesting stats starting to kind of show a global perspective as well.
Amanda?
Thank you. I suppose I saw one which was saddening and one which was making me feel more positive. The saddening one was the fact that, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'll do that afterwards instead. So the saddening one was the fact that still half the people who were surveyed are citing workload and volume of work as one of the reasons why they're not taking time for themselves and potentially recovering. And the reason why I'm saddened by it is from our research, we identified that there were 3 main predictors of burnout. One was volume, second one was complexity, and the third was the toxic relationship with the line manager. So if people aren't taking their holiday, their annual leave, which is what we often see, or they're not taking time to recover and to build their level of resilience and their strength, then they are going to be putting themselves in a worse place and potentially be on the course for burnout. So that was the one that saddened me. But the one that made me feel happy was the fact that 2/3, so 63%, are saying that working from home has improved their mental health. So that's the good news. And I was very, I thought it was great, all that data around hybrid working, which was excellent. And now for the intro. So my name's Amanda. I'm the CEO of Zircon and Be Talent, and I've been a psychologist for now 30 years, and I've been running a consulting firm, but I host a podcast, The Chief Psychology Officer, and I do huge amounts of research in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Ashley, hello.
Hi there. Yeah, I am Ashley Weinberg. I work at the University of Salford. As you can see from the view behind me, it's a wonderful place here, and it's a glorious day up in the Greater Manchester area. And those of you who believe me will be thinking, I'm not so sure about this. But so I'm a work psychologist and very interested in sort of working groups and their mental health, and have been for a number of years. So I've written books and produced reports in this area, and really fascinated to see this report. Isabel, thank you so much for your presentation. It's an honor to be on this panel with you all as well. I think what struck me, and I think this was sort of picked up a little bit by Amanda there, was around how we design work in the first place. And it's that thing that kind of, Gavin, you mentioned earlier on as well, kind of what we're doing upstream to try and make sure things are well set. Because what we're picking up here, and Isabel, you show it in your report, is a phenomenally high percentage of people with symptoms of psychological distress. I see we've got a slight reduction in some ways on last year, but I guess if hand on heart, these are still very, very high prevalence figures. And there's some, people are suffering there. Whilst the Warwick-Edinburgh scale shows a slight return to where things were in 2019, it's interesting when you ask people directly how actually they tell you about their experiences of depression and anxiety in much higher percentages than the general population. But what's happening in the workplace and that relationship with managers, whilst 58%, I think, 57% say I can talk to my manager openly about my mental health, that means 43% can't. Almost half don't feel they can have that conversation. And when asked, I don't think my workplace is doing enough to help employees with their mental health, 41% agree. In other words, 59% don't feel that's the case. So we're still, as you mentioned, Gavin, a long way to go with this. And I guess that's what struck me. And apologies for not sounding as even-handed, Amanda, as you there, and Emily as well. But yeah, I see there's lots to do.
Yeah. Last but by no means least, Antonia. Same
Hi
question.
everyone. Hi everyone. I'm Antonia and I'm a consultant at Calder. Yeah, I went through the findings and really interesting, but I guess it wasn't too much of a surprise to me. I think I've been in PR for about 5 to 6 years, and I think even 5, 6 years ago, it was sort of the same conversations, and I saw loads of situations where mental health was ignored or people weren't feeling too well but felt pressure to come into work. So the 91% stat wasn't too much of a surprise, to be honest, because I feel like the last 2 years have been hard for the PR industry and many industries too. I think what I found the most compelling in research was there was a section around outside friends and family, like your work family was sort of the second ranking in terms of sort of your confidence. So it just goes to show the important role employees and colleagues and that sort of circle of influence you have in the workplace is super, super important when it comes to mental health and feeling comfortable in a work environment. So I do think it's a case of sort of leaders doing their part, but also colleagues creating that environment for each other.
Yeah. Great, thanks. I mean, I'm going to kind of start on the workload, and I mean, I guess maybe Amanda, but sort of throwing it open as well. I mean, look, I've worked in the industry for over 25 years now, and it is a constant battle. I mean, I just wonder if there's any kind of insight you've got, and maybe even Isabel, when you compare it to other industries, what is it that the comms industry is seemingly finding it hard to get a kind of handle on when it comes to workload and kind of maybe unreasonable deadlines? I mean, look, we're in client service. Is it as an industry we find it hard to say no to clients and are constantly trying to deliver? I mean, it'd be great, yeah, if you've got any insights on that, and what could we be doing better as an industry to manage our workload?
Shall I go first, Isabel? I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about the neuroscience behind why we act the way we do and why we drive ourselves so hard. And if you think about it, we are pushing ourselves constantly to be the best we can be. And some of us are prone to biases like perfectionism, imposter syndrome, which can trigger certain emotions in us. And if you think about it, our brains are wired for safety risks, and we are attentive to those negative risks, and as a result we have a negativity bias. So if you think about it, our brains are on autopilot every day. We deal with 11 million pieces of information. 99% of that information is automatic and below consciousness, and so we don't realize that actually the decisions that we're making every day is sending ourselves into this alert fight or flight response mode all the time. And so the decisions we're making around perfectionism, wanting to be the very best we can be, sometimes trying to prove ourselves not to be that imposter, what we're doing is we're priming ourselves to almost be overly aware of that stress and that anxiety. And so we have this thing called a negativity bias. And what we need to do actually is to have healthier habits to look after ourselves, go for a walk in the morning, look at the sun, and those sorts of things.
Interesting. Isabel, is there any kind of insight when you compare comms to other industries and kind of workloads and how highly bat scores in other sectors maybe?
Yeah, I will answer that, but I just had one point, which was just that we do have a couple of kind of open-ended questions, and some of those are kind of called out in the full report, but some kind of themes in general that people were mentioning about workloads was partly a kind of idea about how the industry looks, and that the industry is just you have a high workload, and so people felt like they couldn't take time off because it was expected of them. And also some comments in terms of people feeling like they were too senior and they didn't want to be kind of, you know, calling out the high workload and then having that kind of look badly on them, or them having a kind of perception of being someone who can handle a high workload and not wanting to kind of impact their career. And so I think there is kind of, yeah, an expectation that sometimes we put on ourselves that we don't want to break that, and we don't want to be seen to not being able to handle things, which comes from kind of a personal thing, but also, yeah, people were talking about expectations of the industry. And haven't looked at those kind of questions for the general population in comparison, but I do know that, yeah, we do see in other industries like the research industry, they also have high levels of workload, and this is also, you know, a key thing for them, again, in comparison to kind of the general population. So I think it is kind of an environment that you kind of get thrown into, and it's hard to sometimes to break that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, after 25 years, it does seem that way. One for Emily, actually. I mean, obviously, workload is having a big impact on it, but we talked about some of the societal, I talked about some of the kind of current societal challenges. Are you seeing those having an increasing impact on mental health in the workplace as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think the really tricky thing that we find, particularly when it comes to mental health in the workplace, is obviously you're not in a bubble. You are a whole person that comes to work, and you have everything else going on in your life, be it these various crises around the world, in the UK, wherever it might be, as well as your own personal things going on. So I think that is part of the way that workplaces do need to approach it, is realizing this is a whole person, and just what you see, yes, we spend a lot of our time in the workplace, but actually what you see there is only one part of obviously what's going on in their life. So the workplace can add these different stresses, which could compile on top of these other things going on. But certainly we're seeing, I think, and particularly in younger generations that are kind of thinking about all of these different things, it's adding to those anxiety levels, and we're kind of seeing that compounding. And, you know, there's lots of talk about kind of, you know, generation, I always forget which is which, but Generation Z, I think, is the youngest one at the moment, of that kind of consciousness around, say, something particularly around climate change and that kind of climate change anxiety. So all of these things are just kind of adding up, but none of them exist in isolation. So I think that is one of the things, like I say, to kind of think of that whole person. And the other thing is, which is when people might be worrying about all of these things, the common thing that will come together is the fact that it will impact people's mental health. So again, these crises we might talk about, and they might have financial impacts, and they might have impacts in terms of the way you travel or whatever it might be, but they will often therefore have that kind of lasting mental health impact. So yeah, as a kind of employer, I guess it's being aware of those other external factors that are going to be influencing your employees, that they again kind of might manifest essentially in the workplace, but aren't necessarily caused by, it's just the fact we are spending so much of our time in that space.
Yeah. And have you seen ways that the research that you and other organizations are doing kind of helping employees better tackle the challenges they're facing as businesses and their staff are facing? Have you seen kind of sort of positive results?
Yeah, I think, I mean, part of it is just like this, having these conversations. And again, going back to some of the results that Isabel was just talking about, you know, people feeling like they can't take that time off because of what people will think. A really strong thing we've seen, and there has been research to show that actually that kind of modeling, essentially, of people modeling that behavior can have a really positive impact in an organization. So for example, one of our trustees, a fantastic guy called Chris Parsons, works at Herbert Smith Freehills. If you look him up, if you haven't ever heard of him before, he speaks really openly about his experience with depression, alcoholism. And so at HSF, where he works, that's had a really positive impact of someone so senior talking about it, the fact they've had to take time off, they're role modeling that behavior. But he's also, and again, this is the other side, it's good that people talk about it, but then if they can show how that organization then helped them as well, again, it helps signpost people to understand where it is that they can then access that support, and that it is possible to be able to take that time off and come back, even at that really senior level. So there's a lot of research now to show having those champions essentially within an organization is really impactful. And the other piece, which Gavin, you'll be very aware of, is that mental health first aid piece, that kind of peer-to-peer support. Again, there's a huge amount of research out there that shows how positive that is, but not just for those people accessing the support through that means, but actually for the people themselves volunteering their time and giving that peer support. It really helps people feel like they're giving something back, that in a situation that can feel very, you know, that it's taking your power away, actually it gives people a sense of meaning, a sense of like they're doing something to help. You know, if you think about the COVID pandemic, people there was a huge rise in volunteering because people felt so powerless, and actually being able to volunteer, doing your little bit, really helped people get through that kind of phase. So again, that peer support element and that kind of role modeling side, I think, is really important through the research that we've seen.
Great. Antonia, actually, I mean, while we're talking about Gen Z and like younger generations in the workplace, have you got any views on like what leaders could be doing better? I mean, we heard some about like being an example, but I mean, have you got any other kind of insight into what leaders, businesses can be doing to better protect and support their teams, and certainly kind of younger staff as well?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with what was just said. I think being open and being transparent and bringing up the conversation. I don't think sort of a leader needs to sort of go through it personally to be able to signpost people to it. So just being able to checking on people. How are you? How are you doing? And I think a lot of people who are going through sort of a challenge with mental health oftentimes find it really hard to say so, if we just said in the research. So it's almost, I know a lot of employees won't have mental health qualifications or training to sort of see people and understand if they're not feeling well, but even just checking in if you feel like something's not quite right there is really helpful, because I do think there is a lot of responsibility for the person to also let people know that they are struggling, but sometimes it's hard to get your words out. So just making sure there's an open work environment. And also I think it's calling out bad behavior in the office. So PR is a really challenging industry, very high pressured. Managers, senior managers are under a lot of pressure too, and we're all human, so it does come out in different ways. But calling out when a senior member of staff or junior member of staff is just being quite nice to someone for no reason, I think is really, really helpful, because it's that workplace environment where it can be a little bit toxic that adds to people's mental health. So I think calling out that type of behavior in front of people as a team and let people know this is not okay, it's also a really great way to foster that trust with the younger generation, because as you can see, they're a lot more vocal than older generations. When they're unhappy or they feel really strongly about something, they will say so. So I think speaking their language too is a really great way to sort of show them that as an employer you care. And it's important because you need to retain them. So showing that and keeping them in a business is also important for PR. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, sort of kind of linked to this, and one for you, Ashley, is quiet quitting is something we've heard quite a lot of recently. I mean, I did read an article the other day, actually, but the guy, I can't remember his name, who first kind of started coining the phrase is now back to doing 50, 60-hour weeks. But I wondered, like, is quiet quitting, is it a meme almost, or is it actually this is like the reshift of the workplace and protecting of the boundaries between work-life balances, and it's actually part of that journey?
I think you're absolutely right. The phrase "the psychological contract" is not one that necessarily trips off the tongue, but that sort of set of unwritten expectations that we all have is something we revisit daily when we go into work. It doesn't have to be a huge issue. Sometimes it's kind of whether, you know, you've been that office you were promised, or even the nice green plants they said they would come and water, or actually the promotion you were after. If you don't feel that your psychological contract's been fulfilled and the unwritten expectations have in some way been violated, then naturally you rewrite that contract in your head and you think, actually, you know, to hell with it. The rest of this week, you won't see a lot of me, or the next month, or I may even look for another job. You know, so I think that's something we revisit. Part of that, coming back to what Amanda was saying about how we're wired earlier on, it's very much linked to survival. You know, and the workplace is the jungle we're all in. You know, so that is a tricky bit. But in terms of organizations and what they can do to address that, I think it's important, particularly at senior board level, to provide time, and this may sound a little dramatic, to actually make time and have staff well-being an agenda item, a standing item, because the research shows the more time they spend talking about this, which currently may not be a huge deal, actually the more time they do spend, organizations will do more about that. They'll raise awareness, they'll put things in place, and they may even do the thing, dare I say, of risk assessing their decisions for the impact on staff well-being. If all organizations did this, if all prime ministers did this, what am I saying? Then we would find actually things are in a much better state, because they're being cognizant of the impact of what's happening on their staff. And quiet quitting, I think you're right, we'll have different words for it as phases come and go, but our ability to assess what we're doing all the time, it's natural to us, and we tend to prioritize our needs.
And have you seen any examples where boards or board level teams are doing that, or have you got any examples of that happening in real time?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's probably wrong for me to name other organizations, I guess, because sometimes those conversations don't always happen in a public forum, but certainly research, we published a paper 3 years ago with organizations employing 250,000 people across the UK, whether it's the nuclear industry through to universities or major retail outlets. And certainly where they do that, then you will find they're putting into place some of the guidance from NICE, the National Institute for Clinical and Health Excellence. There's actual NICE guidance, not just for drugs for cancer and heart disease, but for improving well-being at work. And organizations often know about it, but don't do it. And I think if you make time for them to have those conversations, guess what's going to happen? So I think there's clearly scope for that. And there's, even within our own universities are appalling now, would you believe, the workload. I know everyone likes to think we have the whole summer off. Those days have gone. And so we've had to, on our World Mental Health Day event, we launched a new policy to staff mental health and well-being. And it's something across our sector that hasn't really existed, to be honest. So yeah, there are examples, but there's a long way to go.
Amanda, I wonder if you've got anything to add on that, the quiet quitting piece.
I think my observation is the intention is often very good from line managers. They don't intentionally go out to quietly fleece time from their employees. They just often go to the individuals who they can rely upon, who are going to deliver, who are accountable, who own the outcome and take complete ownership of the problem. And so as a result, they quietly fleece that employee every weekend of doing that extra time. And eventually what happens is that individual starts to get tired, starts to be a bit disgruntled and starts to feel like they're being put upon. And so I often feel with a lot of these things that the intention is good. It's the same with psychological safety and the relentlessness of work at the moment, particularly in universities. I've got a couple of universities that are clients, and people are exhausted. And that relentlessness comes from a desire to do the best they can, but you can for your students. But it undermines another concept that we could talk about, which is psychological safety. It undermines trust and belief. And what happens is people stop admitting mistakes. They start socially hiding and just staying under the radar. So I think it comes from a good place, but actually the impact can be quite negative.
And I guess it's not all about employers either. It's a two-way relationship. Accepting that it can be difficult for staff to speak up, but is there any advice to kind of what employees can do to kind of help their workplace be better for them?
So for me, it's all about creating an environment of accountability and owning the outcome where people feel like they have the opportunity to influence, that they are really clear on the purpose and why they're doing something and the role that they're going to play. Because if you say to someone, I'm going to hold you to account, I'm going to tell you what to do, that person will take responsibility, but as soon as that job is finished, they will walk away. And they don't feel like they are part of the solution. They just feel like they're a tool in the toolkit. And so for me, I'm thinking about it more from the leader's perspective rather than from the individual perspective. I will want that person to really own it, to be part of the design, to be part of the purpose, but also to have really good open communication of, I'm tired. It seems like there are other people in this team you can come to and ask for help. So a number of things.
Yeah. I wonder, Emily, have you got any kind of advice on kind of key actions individuals can take kind of at any level to kind of help promote healthy work environments?
Yeah, I think, the challenge again in this area for us is, again, that piece I mentioned of the kind of remembering it's a whole person and not just in the workplace, because I think a lot of the things that are out there, and I will look at Amanda and Ashley as I say this, there's a lot of kind of workplace interventions being touted around that don't have a huge amount of evidence behind them. And from our respect are also quite worrying. You have the potential to do harm in this space. So it's something from a research perspective that we're really aware of. So actually it often will come back to things that are just about you generally and your mental health more broadly than in your specific workplace side of things. So again, would second everything that Amanda's saying there. A big part of when it comes to things like particularly anxiety and depression will be when you feel like that control has been taken away from you. So again, thinking about ways that you can find that and those conversations with your line manager and trying to kind of approach those conversations and talking about them as early as you possibly can. Obviously, that being said, you've got to feel like you've got that supportive environment to be able to do that. So I think, yeah, those are some of the things that we look at. And I think also think about where you can find that help elsewhere as well, whether that be through your family and friends and support groups, whether you are at that stage where you do need to kind of look to talking to your doctor, that kind of stuff as well. Is I think there's a lot of pressure put on workplaces to provide everything to be able to kind of support that person. Whereas again, it comes back to you're a person outside of work as well, and there are all those different things you can use to kind of try and find that help, and again find that evidence-based help as well.
I mean, do we think is the workplace generally where a lot of the time these things get noticed, or there are kind of, it manifests itself maybe more in the workplace?
Yeah, I think so, for a couple of reasons. I mean, again, partly just because you're spending that time there, and also if you think about it now, you're spending so much time on a screen and people might be able to see things there. But again, if you're someone living on your own, for example, it is always going to be that workplace that might spot those things because they're going to be seeing you much more. But often the other side of that is, just noticing as a person. The other side is obviously the work side of things. If work levels are starting to slip, both in terms of amount that person's producing as well as the quality, those are kind of things people kind of start to pick up on. And I guess as a manager side of things, any of those things, when you're starting to see perhaps that quality or that standard of work is falling, approaching it from perspective of, what is going on with that person, as opposed to they're not delivering, what is the problem here? It's actually, checking in with that person, as Antonia was saying, making sure, like, how are they doing? Are they okay? Are there those outside factors influencing them? What do those things look like? And I guess going from that angle first, as opposed to kind of going in and saying, this is a problem we need to sort out. That kind of, I guess, just going in as a human-centered kind of personal approach.
Yeah, great. Antonia, I know you do a lot of work in the area of DEI. It's something you're very passionate about. And I just wondered if you had any insight on like how mental health challenges, or even like the ability to speak up, is experienced in minorities.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I don't think with the conversation of mental health, I don't think we can talk about it without intersectionality, because I feel like it's such a key and core part of why someone might experience mental health challenges. I can only talk about it perspective as a Black woman, but I've definitely felt in the past in other agencies, racial bias played a very massive role in how I felt at that time. And it was when I did speak up, it was sort of responded to by it didn't exist. And that left a really lasting impression on me. But that's just me being sort of Black. You can be Asian, from the queer community, a person who's disabled, for example, so many different factors. And I do think when you're from sort of an underrepresented group, it's even harder to take that time off or to be vocal, because you feel like you have to work a bit harder, because you look so different, you don't fit in with the work culture if you're working in a predominantly white space. So that is quite tricky. So I do find that, speaking to colleagues and friends in other agencies, there's a bit of hesitation to be upfront about their needs or want to take time off because they haven't been promoted in 5 years, for example, and a peer has. So they have to work twice as hard or be really careful about what they're saying if it's tied to their race, for example, gender, sexuality, for example. So that is even a double thing for them to think about, which makes it really harder. And I don't want this to sound negative, but there's so many ways you can go around that. So I don't think you have to be a Black woman to understand a Black woman, for example, if you're a line manager. It's literally about creating that work environment. If you feel, and just making an extra effort to get to know that person, I think. I know with the Black Lives Matter movement, there was a lot of conversation, a lot of people talking about race for the first time ever in the PR sort of sector. And I think that was really, really helpful for the Black community. Yes, traumatic, but it invited that conversation. So I feel like if that's fed into mental health conversations in the workplace, people from different groups will be more empowered to say how they feel and not be met with resistance. So I think that's the key part of it. But definitely, I think when it comes to those groups, it's definitely harder, for sure.
Seeing kind of improvements, or are you seeing things getting better, or is it still like a lot to do?
Yeah, 100%. With the work I do at Calder and sort of the inclusive marketing and comms, a lot of brands and businesses want to work with inclusive agencies. So agencies have no choice but to listen to different groups now, because they need to retain that staff. For you to retain Black, Asian, queer, disabled people, you're going to have to be able to understand them, speak to them, create an environment where they can flourish. And if you can't, then after a while, those big organizations and brands will be turning around and be like, okay, we want to contract you, but your team is all white, for example. And it's almost, you have to sort of take that into account when it comes to building a team and retaining people, especially with the younger generation, Gen Z. They are a lot more inclusive, a lot more outspoken, a lot more sure about themselves when it comes to everyday settings, which I do admire and I'm a bit jealous of. And those are the questions they're asking when they're interviewing and going for jobs. They're asking you, so, you know, how many people at XYZ? What do you do for this? What is your social work life like? Most of the time, it's not about the actual work, it's how they feel. So that definitely needs to be incorporated in how agencies are sort of serving their different groups of people in their workforce.
Great. I was gonna just try and sort of end it. I mean, we're getting towards the end, so sort of end it on a kind of uplifting but also kind of practical note. There's a lot of great discussion. I think we could probably carry on talking about various things for another hour at least, but I'm going to ask kind of each one of you to share kind of what's the one takeaway or top tip you'd like to leave our audience with today. Just something they can go away with to make them think. Maybe it's advice they've not heard before. Start with you, Isabel, because I can see you first on the screen.
I guess mine would be to kind of keep being authentic. So no matter where you sit in your kind of organization structure, to be really authentic with your employees, with your employer, about how you're personally feeling, to keep that conversation open about mental health, and really to kind of lead authentically. So, you know, no one has it perfect. There's kind of no quick fix for any of these things that we're talking about, but just to keep kind of moving forward, keeping that conversation open and being really genuine about how we're all kind of coping and dealing with things, sharing tips within ourselves, but also being able to share when we are struggling.
Great. Amanda?
Sorry for the delay. So we've done some really interesting research looking at positive and negative affect. So that people who are prone to negative affect, negative emotions, are more likely to procrastinate, less likely to be able to make decisions, drive cultures that are consensus driven, that undermine success of organizations. So in order to be the best you can be as individuals, as leaders, you need to be healthy. One of the ways to be healthy is to have healthy habits, to go for a walk every morning, to get in the fresh air. And an actual tip is, if you're anxious and you're stressed, what happens is we've got tunnel vision. To remove the tunnel vision, two things: get up, walk about, look at the panorama. And secondly, it's a physiological sigh, which is a double inhale, single exhale, because it removes the carbon dioxide from the blood and from the lungs and reduces that feeling of frustration. And so helps you get back to that feeling of positive affect from the feeling of negative, and you'll be back feeling in control.
Great. Emily?
Thanks. Yeah, I think mine might just, I guess, reinforce particularly what Amanda was saying there. And it's probably one people have heard before, but it's that idea of, to be able to help other people, you do need to look after yourself. And a great way to remember that is, you know, when you're on that plane and they're doing their instructions that no one's listening to about what happens in an emergency, they always say, you know, if you're going to put the oxygen mask, come down, put your own on first before you help anyone else with theirs. And it's just a useful analogy to make you realize, you know what, you can't support those people. You can't be there for them as they need unless you're making sure you're there for yourself and looking after yourself. So I think when we're talking about, you know, your own responsibility within this is doing all those things Amanda's talking about, looking after your own mental health and knowing when you need to seek that help as well, means you'll be better able to support those people around you.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, one thing I will let you do it actually as well, but I think that looking after yourself and actual physical health as well, and exercise, whether it is, Amanda, just walking around the block, getting some fresh air, or actually working out to relieve the stress, for pressure, giving you a clear way to think about things is really, really important. Ashley?
Thanks, Gavin. I guess two things really that strike me. One, at the individual level, is maybe to write down, what is your psychological contract? What are your unwritten expectations? And you can almost draw that line down the page or your screen and see what the ones from the employer are as well. And is that fair? Does that feel right? And if it doesn't, maybe there's someone you can have that conversation with. It's not always easy. But in terms of the organization, that switch off time that's been discussed already, kind of the look after myself kind of thing. Is there an email policy? Is there a time where actually you're not expected to respond to a message, 6:30, is that going to be the cutoff? 5:30 or 7:30 in the morning, whatever it might be. Discuss that with your team. See if there's email policy you can adopt as a team to safeguard each other. Then it becomes not just your responsibility, but one of the whole department and ultimately the organization as well, I'd hope.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, actually, and it's something, I mean, when we think back to the conversation around workload and like being client services and being afraid to say no, it's something actually in the pandemic we set up with our client in assembly, to make sure that on both sides we're not kind of breaching kind of work-life balance. We are working in a sensible way, and we're doing it together rather than it just be something that we're doing agency side. I think bringing clients into that type of thing is really important. Antonia.
Yeah, sure. So I can only speak from sort of what has helped me personally, but I know it's easier said than done, but do try and confide in someone, even if it's outside work, just to sort of offload, because oftentimes it's so pent up and it will just come out in such a really harsh way. So definitely speak to someone. And I think what I found really helpful over the last year or so is writing things that specifically trigger me, because personally it would take certain things, I'm just like, oh, that makes me feel uncomfortable. So just identifying what it is in your role or who it is, for example, if there's a particular client that's making you feel worse that day, identifying that is really helpful, because then you can find ways with your line manager or work friend or family of ways to sort of work around that. So if you have a meeting with that person, if you call that person, what can you do to sort of offset how you might feel in that moment? I think that's a really good way, sort of just day by day, short term.
Yeah, great advice, everyone. I think I'd kind of reiterate the speaking to somebody you trust, whether it's a colleague, a friend, a relative, or if you're at Edelman, a mental health first aider. That first step is, however big or small the challenge is, I think is a big way to kind of starting to overcome it. Well, look, thanks guys. Really enjoyed the conversation. I think there's certainly things I'll be taking back to Edelman as an MHFA, but also as an MD of a team. Want to thank you for joining us. Hopefully we'll get to do this again another time. But really appreciate it. I think, look, it's critical that we all, as an industry, continue to talk about mental health, continue to take great research and the insights that gives us to make our workplaces better places to be. Big thank you to you guys on the panel. Thank you to Opinium, PRCA, and the CIPR, and my colleagues at Edelman Health for making today possible. Have a great rest of day. See you soon. Bye-bye.